So, when we picture the Ottoman Empire, we usually think of this unstoppable military machine, right? Expanding borders, massive conquests. But today, we're diving into a really wild historical paradox for this explainer. We are looking at why the front line of the Ottoman Empire was actually a whole lot safer than the stunning gilded halls of its very own palace.
To really grasp the sheer scale of the danger we're talking about, just consider this number for a second: 30,000. That's the estimated number of executions ordered by just one ruler, Sultan Selim the Grim, in an 8-year reign. I mean, doing the math, that is a staggering amount of bloodshed. The absolute epicenter of the empire wasn't some safe, cushy haven. It was literally a lethal environment. Topkapi Palace operated on a system of structured terror, meaning if you are anywhere near the top of the food chain, you are in extreme danger.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be covering 1. Deadlier than the battlefield. 2. The law of fratricide. 3. The palace execution apparatus. 4. The madness of the cage. 5. The sultanate of women. And finally, 6. The janissary threat.
Let's start with section 1. Deadlier than the battlefield. The architecture of absolute peril.
Okay, picture this. Out on the battlefield, Ottoman soldiers were deploying these devastating martial techniques. They trained constantly and even used this thing called the kinetic Ottoman slap, a literal open-handed strike with enough force to shatter a human skull. Archaeologists have actually verified this, which is insane. But here's the thing. Those soldiers faced calculated military risks. Back home at the palace, administrators and royals faced arbitrary, sudden executions. Seriously, your structural risk of dying was way higher if you were wearing fine silk in the palace than if you were strapped into armor out on the frontier.
Moving on to Section 2, the law of fratricide, the legalization of murder.
Now, the terrifying legal mechanism behind all this family bloodshed was actually driven by pure panic. See, the Ottomans were absolutely terrified of an old Turkic tradition called ulesh. Basically, this tradition treated the empire as the shared property of the entire ruling family, meaning it was supposed to be divided up among all the sons.
As you can guess, that was a total recipe for disaster.
After a devastating 11-year civil war in the early 1400s, where 4 brothers quite literally fought to the death for the throne, the empire realized that divided sovereignty would completely destroy the state. So, they came up with a pretty ruthless alternative to keep things unified.
Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror perfectly laid out this incredibly grim math in his decree. He basically calculated that murdering your own siblings was a necessary public service to prevent thousands of deaths in a civil war. He literally put it into law for nizam-i-kalem, the common benefit of the people. And to back him up, the ulama, the religious scholars, basically gave it the green light by applying the legal concept of choosing the lesser of two evils.
But this wasn't just some abstract legal theory sitting in a dusty book. It was a strict mandate taken to absolute extremes. For example, Sultan Mehmed III, he had all 19 of his brothers strangled the very same day he took the throne in 1595. 19! It wasn't a suggestion, it was a mandate. Even innocent infants were murdered in their cribs with silk handkerchiefs the exact moment he took power, all to secure the throne and wipe out any potential future rivals. Just brutal.
Let's look at Section 3, the palace execution apparatus, mutes, gardeners, and red sherbet. So, to actually carry out these lethal decrees inside the palace, the Sultan relied on some highly specialized agents. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't they just use an axe or a sword? Well, because of an ancient Mongol Turkic taboo, royal and noble executions had to be completely bloodless. Spilling noble blood onto the physical earth was strictly forbidden, which meant they had to rely on incredibly specific, suffocating methods of execution instead. To maintain this sort of eerie, silent dignity in the court, the Sultan used the Dilzizler. These were elite, deaf-mute executioners who dispatched nobles silently using silk bowstrings. Because they communicated entirely through a complex sign language, absolute discretion was guaranteed. There were no dramatic public spectacles for the royals, no grand final speeches, just the terrifying, completely silent arrival of the mutes.
But it gets so much weirder. If you were a Grand Vizier, a bad performance review could literally result in a 300-yard foot race for your life. Seriously, if you were condemned, they'd serve you a fatal red sherbet. After you drank it, you had to sprint through the palace gardens against the head gardener, who, by the way, doubled as the executioner. If you managed to beat him to the fish market gate, congratulations, you were exiled. But if you lost the race, executed on the spot.
Section 4, the madness of the cage, the cure worse than the disease.
Eventually, as you'd expect, public outrage started to boil over regarding the mass slaughter of royal kids. So the empire tried to find a more humane alternative, but it ended up creating a completely different kind of nightmare. Instead of killing the brothers, the Ottomans started locking them in something called the kafes, or the gilded cage. This was a luxurious prison deep inside the harem where they were isolated from the entire outside world, kept company only by barren concubines, and basically left to do things like macrame. In the past, princes were sent out to govern provinces to learn how to actually run an empire. Now, they were stripped of all that training and kept under permanent, closely watched house arrest.
As you can imagine, this extreme isolation caused profound psychological and cognitive damage. Just try to picture spending your entire life locked inside a single suite of rooms, and then one day someone suddenly hands you the keys to a global superpower. To put that into perspective, Muhammad VI, the very last sultan, spent his first 56 years, more than half a century, in this state of absolute confinement. When these men finally took the throne, they were completely, utterly unprepared for the crushing weight of ruling.
Section 5. The Sultanate of Women. Power Vacuums and Harem Warfare.
Because you had these mentally fragile, cage-raised sultans sitting on the throne, a massive power vacuum opened up right in the center of the government. And this gave rise to what's known as the Sultanate of Women. This was an era where incredibly brilliant, often foreign-born queen mothers essentially ran the show. From the hidden, private corridors of the harem, they were directing foreign policy and orchestrating domestic appointments. Because the actual sultans were often either underage or mentally unfit from the cage, women like Hurrem and Qasim Sultan stepped in as the de facto rulers, negotiating with international ambassadors and completely managing the state.
But of course, wielding this kind of shadow power came with immense risks. Take the legendary Qasim Sultan, for instance. After dominating the empire for 50 years, she was literally dragged from a wardrobe and strangled to death with a curtain during a violently chaotic harem coup. The harem wasn't just living quarters, it was a lawless battleground for factional warfare. When Qasim tried to plot against her own grandson, her daughter-in-law struck first, proving that no one, not even the most powerful woman in the empire, was safe from the palace's structured violence.
Which brings us to Section 6, the Janissary threat, the enemy at the gates. This was the ultimate threat to the Ottoman sultans. And the crazy part? This danger didn't actually come from their family members. It came from their very own elite guards. If we track this timeline across the centuries, you can watch the Janissaries mutate from this highly disciplined infantry force into arrogant kingmakers who basically held veto power over the entire state. If their pay was a little late, or if a sultan tried to introduce military reforms that threatened their cushy privileges, they would literally just march right up to the palace, demand heads, and depose the ruler.
Things got completely out of hand in 1622 with the teenage Sultan Osman II. When he tried to put a leash on their power and form a new army, the Janissaries outright mutinied. They stormed the palace, dragged the young sultan to a fortress, and brutally strangled him, completely shattering the myth of the untouchable sultan. Contemporary chronicles actually note he was subjected to horrific physical torture before he died. This set a terrifying new precedent. The absolute monarch could be lynched by his own military. The final breaking point didn't come until the auspicious incident in 1826. Sultan Mahmud II realized he had to fight fire with fire, so he intentionally incited a revolt. He brought out the Holy Banner to rally the public on his side, and then he turned his own artillery directly on the Janissary barracks. He essentially massacred his own troops to win back his empire, completely wiping out the 135,000-strong core and finally ending centuries of military extortion. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Can a state that is built on the constant execution of its own elites ever truly escape the cage of its own violence? The Topkapi Palace was undeniably a masterpiece of architecture, but it was also a perfectly tuned machine designed for dynastic containment and sudden death. It stands out as a pretty stark reminder that sometimes, the closer you are to absolute power, the closer you are to a very sudden, very silent end. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.